Greetings, fellow travelers on the journey of life. It's been richly rewarding to look for Spirit's presence in the 8 decades of my life journey. Where was Spirit? I conceptualize Spirit as the energy of love, and love as the energetic force that powers joy, gratitude, hope, and peace. All goodness in life. Spirit, love, they're one and the same. Spirit love nurtures. When we devote our love to nurture family, work, what we believe in, Spirit is at work. Spirit love connects. We feel that energy in intimacy, beauty, music, creating, and so much more. Here in church, when we pass the peace or sing the communion, my heart warms, my eyes get teary. That same energy connects us in friendship and fellowship, the feeling of being known and belonging the way I feel at Canadian Memorial. Spirit love challenges, but it also sustains. We experience those energies in life's struggles and ups and downs. I've come to see Spirit everywhere, in intuition, serendipity, and in so many daily moments, like a stranger's smile in passing. And I realize that over the years, Spirit has been at work in me, growing my capacity to love others, to love myself, and to love God. It's a work in progress, thank God. So I begin this account of my spiritual journey with gratitude to the Holy Spirit for the gift of life and for Spirit's help in living it. I was a first child, born in Vancouver to a young mother and a father in the Air Force. I was a baby in Comox, a child in Toronto, where my brother was born, and a young teen in Trenton, Ontario. 5 moves to 5 homes, 5 schools in my first 15 years. That made me somewhat comfortable with moving, which served me well after I left home because I did a lot of it. But it left me prone to feeling like an outsider. In Toronto, my family attended a Baptist church. In Trenton, an Anglican church on the air base, where I sang in the junior choir and taught Sunday school. Well, actually, I helped, I didn't teach. I was confirmed, though, in the United Church on a nearby air base. So I was grounded in Christianity as best one can be as a youngster. I resonated with Jesus' life and teachings, especially in the transcendence of love. At 15, when my family moved to Calgary, my church-going stopped for a very long while. I went to 2 different high schools for grade 11 and 12, taking buses from the air base into the city. When I applied to the Anglican Church for a bursary to attend university, the bishop of the diocese interviewed me and asked, "Do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God?" Holy compromise. I said what he expected to hear, but did I really believe it? Had I just mortgaged my soul for a bursary? The University of Alberta at Calgary in those days opened me to new life possibilities. Among new friends, I experienced a sense of belonging, Spirit at work. There I met the first of several people, some 10, I think, I consider my spiritual magnets. People who, in diverse and meaningful ways, grew me in love, drawing me into the wider world or into a deeper knowing of myself. And I'm the only one I'll ever know that completely. At 19, the day after graduating with a bachelor's in English, I joined 2 girlfriends on a train to Toronto to live closer to my boyfriend, a spiritual magnet, as he began law school. I was still too young to start teacher training, so I took a bookkeeping job at an oil company. Predictable, comfortable work. And I might have drifted too long in that job had it not been for a second guy I'd met at a law school dance, another spiritual magnet. Thanks to him and his ambitions for us, I followed through on my plan to attend the Ontario College of Education. So, at 22, with my secondary school teaching certificate in hand, I was in my first year of teaching English and Latin at a high school in North York. Before March break, at a teachers' union, I met John Cruickshank. Now there, for me, was a powerful spiritual magnet, not just for the energy of attraction, but for knowing that with him, I could authentically be myself, true belonging. A few months later, though, just before my second year of teaching, I was pregnant. You can imagine my spiritual struggle. Young teacher in the 60s, fear of judgment. John and I framed that event as the universe pushing us into marriage sooner than we'd planned. His parents in Kitchener and mine, then living in Ottawa, had already guessed we'd marry. But pregnant too? On a Friday night in early September, I took the train to Ottawa to break the news to my parents the next day. Overnight, in a very troubled sleep, I had a miscarriage. Was spirit in that serendipitous timing? My parents never knew. Giddy with relief, we married as planned at Leaside United Church over the Thanksgiving weekend, 6 months after meeting. And John, if you're listening, your halo will be shining, because he was a gift from Spirit, a loving balm for my inner critical voice. He was intelligent, appreciative, enthusiastic, fun to be with, and an agent for change, with one important caveat, which I'll get to later. We were married for almost 45 years. In the space of 6 years, John had created a job for himself as athletic director in Ontario's new community college system. We bought our first home in Georgetown. I taught at the local high school and led a Girl Guide company. Then I resigned and gave birth to our first daughter, Karen, and 20 months on to our second, Christina. My spiritual work in those few years that I spent as a full-time stay-at-home wife with 2 babies was trying to be a better parent to them than my parents had been to me. And it didn't come easily. Fortunately for me, there were other women like me. We founded the University Women's Club of Georgetown, a new circle of belonging. Our very first study group was on parenting. And let me fast forward for a moment. Becoming a parent helped me understand and forgive my own parents' limitations. Spirit at work. And those daughters, Karen and Chris, are my spiritual magnets for the superior women they are, the relationships they've created, and the difference they make in their world and in mine. When John's College opened a new college, a campus in Oakville, we moved to Oakville too. I taught part-time in the college's adult retraining program, developing self-instructional lessons in business communications. Although church was not part of our lives, the girls had been christened, and I read to them at times from a Bible storybook. Then John was recruited as a dean to a community college in North York, so we moved again to Thornhill. And there I worked as a consultant for a private career college writing self-instructional manuals. I led my daughter's Girl Guide company, then their Pathfinder company, and served as district commissioner. It was in Thornhill that I learned that my father, then living in Victoria, was in hospital. I flew to see him not realizing that he would pass at the age of 61 before I returned home. In those few days together, he and I connected in a way we hadn't before, spirit in reconciliation. What eventually drew John and me to church was a neighbor's sudden death. At Ed's funeral in the nearby Anglican church, the priest rapped loudly on his coffin and declared, "Ed's not here." And I really don't remember what he said after that, probably something about life after death. All I know is John and I started attending church with our somewhat reluctant daughters and were active in adult Christian education programming. Until one day after the service, when two young guys came to talk to the congregation about the Anglican Church's stance on homosexuality. We didn't know the term gay in those days, and I didn't know any gays, or so I thought. But what was the problem? God is love, right? A couple of older men in the congregation interrupted the presentation, angrily yelling out what I now know as the clobber passages from the Hebrew Scriptures. Spiritual shock. I was horrified. Where was our priest? He wasn't even in the room. With no way to understand or frame that event, my spirit withered. If God wasn't in the church, then I'd have no part of the church either. Soon after, we moved yet again, this time to Edmonton, where John became a community college vice president. We dropped church entirely. I took on full-time work for Alberta Tourism, traveled the province giving customer service seminars, and worked with a team developing a provincial hospitality service program. It was a fun community of belonging. By this time, Chris was in high school, Karen was in university, and John was traveling frequently in his international education portfolio. There came a moment, as there always does, when John's ambition brought me significant marital and spiritual angst. He insisted on applying for the presidency of Vancouver Community College, the second largest college in Canada. And he landed the job. So we moved to Vancouver, leaving Karen in her second year at U of A, affording Chris a gap year before UBC. Rented in the West End, moved to a home in North Vancouver. Despite a rough start, though, as the months passed, John found his stride, as did I. I was hired to develop a volunteer program at Vancouver Opera. And I loved the opera, learning about it, how it's produced, working with some really interesting people and talented. And I found a spiritual magnet there too, in the general director. 2 years later, I became his executive assistant and secretary to the opera board. For me, as for John, new communities of belonging. A few years on, though, both our jobs had become rife with personnel and board drama. Stress was taking a toll. John's upbeat personality seemed to be changing. Only much later did we realize that the onset of diabetes was affecting his bipolar medications and his temperament. For myself, I was menopausal. Need I say more? In the year I turned 50, we drove north on a summer vacation on the winding highway outside of Burns Lake. With John asleep in the passenger seat, I had a micro-sleep at the wheel. The car plunged at full speed into a deep gully. It was totaled. We were shaken up, but okay. Was it spirit at work that a nurse just happened to be driving that empty highway in the opposite direction? When she saw the dust our car kicked up, she called an ambulance. They pried the doors open to free us from the car. And although beaten up, I was exhilarated to be alive. But John struggled with the event, not blaming me, bless his heart, just wondering why bad things happen to good people. As a counselor later commented to me, not to John, like that car, our marriage was going off the road. A few years later, in the very same year, Karen and Chris married. Two great guys, Alan and Josh. Our family circle of belonging had widened. John and I went to couples counseling, but after 31 years of marriage, we agreed, somewhat amicably, to separate legally and did so at dinner on New Year's Eve. We'd had a good run. So you can imagine my chagrin when a couple of months later, John had resigned his presidency, doing exactly what I had been urging him to do before we separated. He took on consulting work in New Zealand and found a new relationship. I stayed in Vancouver with a hole in my heart and sold the house. Where was Spirit in all this? Well, without my focus on John and our marriage, my awareness of the love, capital L love, in my life from others expanded greatly. It opened my eyes. I also lost my fear. Fear of what? I didn't know at the time. I just knew that I could trust the choices I'd make as a solo traveler in life. Spirit and intuition. Soon after, the opera board decided not to renew my boss's contract. And knowing there'd be no more growth for me in that role, a few months after he left, I resigned too. And right out of the blue, thanks to a musician in the orchestra, I was offered a job as an administrator for a boutique commodity taxation firm with an international clientele. 3 people, one of whom would be me. A surprising new venture and perhaps a spiritual rescue. At the end of the millennium, John returned to Vancouver to await word about a senior position he'd interviewed for internationally. Feeling anxious and ungrounded, he reached out to his longtime friend, me, and I kept my guard up until a few months later, when Karen gave birth to our first grandchild in North Vancouver. After visiting the baby and her parents late at night, as John and I walked back to our respective cars, he enthused, "Wasn't that just like Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus?" A blast of love tumbled the defenses around my heart. And so we resumed our life together after that 18-month hiatus. On our 33rd wedding anniversary that October, at dinner with our nuclear family and the baby, we legally recommitted to our marriage. That first granddaughter's middle name is Emmanuel. I didn't choose it, John did. It means God is with us. And once again, of course, we moved, this time to a duplex in North Van. In the next 4 years, Karen and Len had 2 more children. I'm a Grammy, and my Grammy kin, Selene, Madeleine, Etienne, are in their 20s now. Spiritual magnets indeed. As our work commitments wound down, John and I traveled in Australia. Becoming concerned about his judgment, I instigated the move to a smaller home, the condo where I still live, here in Vancouver. It was in Egypt and Jordan that I experienced the Islamic call to worship, the Adhan, as a call from Spirit to me. Goosebumps, teary eyes. I knew I had to try church again, and I knew where to go. To that lovely church on Burrard Street with the provocative signboards. Here were Reverend Bruce Sanguine, Christian mysticism, and programs for spiritual growth. We became members. I joined the ministry and personnel team, and Canadian Memorial has been my spiritual home ever since. My spiritual work at the time was with my brother, who'd been mostly absent from my life, but he was in ill health, lived alone, and he needed me. Reconnecting with him brought up old family issues. I accompanied him to his death at age 60, then led his celebration of life. Taking Susan Dumoulin's Centrepoint spiritual pilgrimage that fall helped with the grieving and the healing. As it turned out, though, the silent retreat at the end of that pilgrimage heralded the start of another difficult year, because John had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer. In the months that I was supporting John as he underwent chemotherapy, a pause, a major operation, a pause, and more chemotherapy, I was also serving on committees assessing our church's ministry needs and searching for a full-time minister to coordinate with Reverend Bruce Sanguin in his new proposed half-time role. I can only thank Spirit for that welcome distraction, for me as for John. And in the midst of all of that came the unexpected death of my mother in Victoria. On what would have been her 89th birthday, I led her celebration of life. I think she would have enjoyed the cake and the balloons. 3 months later, at age 71, John died, and that was 12 years ago. So where do I see Spirit love in all those deaths in 2 years? In the grace John showed in illness and death, never complaining even as his cognition slipped. In the support of my family, in blogging, journaling, mindful meditation, in the strength to handle it all, and in the comfort and uplift of our Sunday services. 2 months after John died, Spirit brought Reverend Beth Hayward to Canadian Memorial. And over the next years, as chair of Ministry and Personnel and coordinator of the Spiritual Gifts Program, I worked closely with Beth. Spirit love in service. And yes, Beth was another spiritual magnet for me. I love her authenticity, energy, and her heart. But guess what? When Spirit brought Jeff to us last fall, I felt as if I'd known him all my life. And so, inshallah, my life journey continues. I found a new circle of belonging right at home in my strata building, in friendships, in neighborliness, and in serving on strata council as the maintenance go-to person. It suits the stage of my life. I'm grateful to Spirit Love for all that has been, the nurturing, connecting, challenging, and sustaining, and for what is now. And thank you, Kathy, for inviting me to share my journey. It's been a ride. And thank you all for your fellowship and witness.